Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have a great episode for you today. We are talking about integrating space into joint warfighting analysis. Before I introduce our host, Russ Rumbaugh, I'd like to tell you where you can find us. We are at Twitter at hashtag the Space Policy Show, or you can ask your questions on Vimeo in the video box below. We'd love to hear from you. You can also sign up for the latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. You just click stay up to date, put your email in. It's that easy. I'd like to introduce Russell Rumbaugh, or as I affectionately call him, R3. He is a systems director at the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy, where he works on defense policy, budgets, acquisitions for the Pentagon, Capitol Hill, and think tanks. He also has special guests Michael Fitzsimmons, Rebecca Reesman, and Webb Ewell joining him today. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you, Russell, to get us started.
Thanks for joining us. As Space Force takes an even bigger role in the Pentagon, we wanted to look at how analysis informs senior decision-making. Modern war is so complex, no one person can rely on their intuition. Moreover, we have little operational experience with many of the weapons used today. We, fortunately, have little operational experience with wars between great powers that use all those weapons. This is doubly true for space, where no one has any experience with hostile acts. But space is also a highly engineered domain that should lend itself to analysis because it is so constrained by physical facts. To explore this topic, we have a panel of esteemed practitioners and scholars of decision-making analysis. All are from one of DoD's FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers, which are nonprofit, government-funded think tanks chartered to serve the national interest. Decision-making analysis is a sweet spot for FFRDCs. It requires deep technical expertise, a ton of work to build and run the models, making it hard for the government to do purely in-house. Yet it also supports some of the most sensitive decisions, including where money gets spent, causing conflicts of interest for for-profit firms. FFRDCs balance that tension, objective analysis and advice free of conflicts of interest, but developed outside the daily press of decisions within government. I think today's panel will highlight why that balance is value to the Space Force. On the panel, we have the Institute for Defense Analyses, Mike Fitzsimmons, who has been supporting scenario development at the Pentagon for more than a decade and wrote the history of the last 15 years of how DoD has used analysis to support decision-making. No one has a better appreciation for the nitty-gritty of how analysis gets built and the reality of how it gets used. From my own Aerospace Corporation, Rebecca Reesman, who in her day job helps the Air Force and Space Force bring models of spacecraft orbit and interact to bigger questions of their role in modern war. Despite being an astrophysicist, she also explores policy issues, and so has a unique understanding in how decisions get made, not just in the math underneath the analysis. From the Center of Naval Analyses, Webb Ewell, who recently stepped down as the head of their wargaming division, an art that Navy has excelled at since they had to explore what steam-powered battleships could do before any had ever fought. Webb also gave one of the best decision-making briefs I've ever seen, holding his own as a room full of four-stars tried to poke holes in the analysis his team had done. With such insights, we can't help but have a very interesting panel. Thanks to all of you for being here. As a big believer of analysis, I work at an FFRDC after all, but also a humble respecter of the contingency of history and idiosyncratic nature of people, I'm fascinated by where we transition from quantitatively informed physics-based models with high accuracy to assumptions about decisions someone will only make in very specific circumstances it is nearly impossible to predict. Can I open by asking of a time each of you saw analysis successfully make that transition and help decision makers make a difficult decision?
Well, Russell, I'm happy to give a stab at that answer to start out here. As you mentioned, a lot of the experience that I've had in this world has been in the realm of scenario planning. And many of your listeners here will be familiar with the 20-year history or so of support to strategic analysis, or what had previously been known as the analytic agenda, which has sort of ceased to exist in the department as it did for 15 years. But your question was about a time that we may have seen analysis kind of effectively support the big picture senior decision making. And one thing I'd offer in that regard was the way that the scenario planning set of scenarios and related analyses was used in support of the now getting fairly ancient history of the 2010 QDR. You know, at that time, we had a pretty different perspective on the range of challenges that we were most interested in terms of force planning and strategy. And something I'd highlight in that regard was this distinction between force sufficiency and force proficiency. I think in the wake of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the emphasis on heavy emphasis on warfighting with respect to great powers and the increasing capabilities of China in particular, you know, casting back to 10 years ago, we had a rather diverse set of challenges and therefore a diverse set of scenarios we were looking to combine. And one of the aspects that highlights is this connection between analysis and the force planning or the force sizing construct, which at the time was relatively complex. And so what you found in that situation, the utility of the scenarios was in part building what they refer to as simultaneity stacks, where you would depict a 10-year time horizon and then combine various scenarios across that time horizon so that you were testing not only the proficiency of the joint force in a future conflict, but its ability to handle conflicts and operational challenges simultaneously in different theaters with different types of capabilities, although sometimes drawing on the same capability in different theaters. Therefore, so the utility in that case was the complexity, I should say, was in trying to do many things with a limited set of resources at the same time. And I think that's one example of where these kind of diverse set of scenarios and detailed data products that supported them was very helpful in determining where you wanted to take risk. If you had to execute multiple operations, both high-end and counterinsurgency, security cooperation, humanitarian response at the same time, in balancing the risk associated with trying to serve all those ends at one time. So that's just one example that's a few steps removed from the physics-based or otherwise detailed mission modeling that I think was useful. So that's you can think of that as sort of an aim point as you move away from the more detailed tactical or physics-based modeling that you're kind of trying to get to support the senior decision makers' needs to balance resources and risks across the whole program and across the whole future set of challenges.
I think I'd take the opposite approach to that. Oh. Go ahead. This lag is terrible.
Space is particularly sensitive to what Mike just described, right? We are transitioning from the space support, which is there to support the terrestrial operations, to action in space, maybe even by itself. It also seems interesting, though, sufficiency. Are we even considering sufficiency when you look at going against great powers?
Yeah, well,
Webb, you're going to tell your...
I'll take a stab at that as well. You know, one of the highlighted features of the 2018 National Defense Strategy was the transition or elimination of the so-called two-war construct that has guided defense planning for the last nearly 30 years in the post-Cold War era. It's not precisely clear what replaces that, but there is a sort of concession in our current strategic planning that simultaneous prosecution of two conventional wars against great powers is beyond the capacity of any conceivable joint force, in a way that was not the case when those two simultaneous wars that guided defense planning were conceived of as, say, Iraq and North Korea, as when we originally started with the two-war construct in the 1990s. So you're right, Russell. I think that this is this simultaneity and force proficiency has a very different flavor to it than it has for the last generation of defense planning.
Which I suspect is going to tee up your point, Webb, because the Navy has long resisted the idea that they should be everywhere. Their whole point is ships can sail across the ocean, which turns out to be connected all around the world. Was that where your different perspective was going to come in?
Actually not. I think that Mike is laid out an idea that somehow these analysis processes can actually answer the question in a decision maker's mind about what mix of force capacity and capability we actually need. But in practice, those decisions are always so complicated and have so much uncertainty in them that there's a lot of judgment involved that analysis can't penetrate. So I think the biggest contribution of analysis is to help the decision maker's intuition and also do the math to make sure that there aren't assumptions inside the decision that are self-contradictory. So, for instance, we've been in a position at various times in the past where we've had force flow assumptions for these overlapping MCOs, but not enough transport to actually do the force flow that we've assumed, and things of that nature, which analysis can illuminate so that you keep the decision makers within the bounds of things that make sense when they ultimately have to make a judgment call on incomplete information. I think that this is going to be particularly true in space because I think most of our senior leaders are not going to have the intuition for the way the space medium works, both for the reason you cited in the introduction that there's essentially no empirical experience, and also because the physics is somewhat counterintuitive. So I think that there's a big role for analysis in supporting those kinds of decisions. If your listeners don't know, I'm not a great fan of the support strategic analysis process, given that I spent about 10 years trying to disassemble the use of campaign modeling from it because we believed it was giving bad answers. And in particular, the reason why the answers are bad is that what the analysis process does is take a set of scenarios and calculate to the best it can what type of forces you need to address them. And somehow that makes you think that you've reduced risk. But the real risk you're taking is that the set of scenarios is the wrong set. And no amount of post-scenario analysis will solve that problem. That's kind of the problem we had in Iraq at the beginning, where all of our scenarios were focused on the initial attack, and we didn't have anything about stability operations. And it's likely that we'll make an equivalent mistake again in the future. I mean, Secretary Gates' remarks when we discussed with him about the scenario process is that we had an unblemished record. We had never once been right about making planning scenarios for war we'd actually fight.
And that sets you up very nicely, Becca. You can choose which path we go down to start this conversation. Space just trying to join those campaign looks, or the other side, as Webb alluded to, the counterintuitive physics of space, throwing off how decision makers do it. I know you have some insight into both of those.
Yeah, well, and I'll start off by saying that analysis has been used to support space-related decisions for decades, and that's a lot of what aerospace's job has been for 60 years. The difference, though, is that for the most part, that's been much more mission-specific. So looking at GPS as a constellation and figuring out how PNT is provided, or looking at particular missile warning constellations and how that does the job it's supposed to do. So what's more relatively new is figuring out how space is a part of the joint fight and how it's a part of then joint analysis and joint decision support writ large. And so that's the newer part struggling with. And some of the points that have already been brought up, right, is that space well, like all domains, space has to abide by physics, but it sort of has slightly unique physics in orbital dynamics and the sheer size of it that make it, like as Webb was just saying, not intuitive to folks. And so there's sort of a whole shift in trying to think about and understand it. So again, historically, whenever space has been a part of a more joint decision conversation, it's usually assumed that space-based capabilities are working at 100%, fully supporting folks on the ground. Or if they're feeling a little crazy, they assume it's not working there. And then we have those discussions about a day without space. But the reality is that it's going to be somewhere in between, and figuring out how to then mesh the physics-based modeling we know how to do very well with this sort of bigger picture, campaign level conversation is I think where we're currently struggling to overcome. And we can learn plenty from other domains, for example.
Webb, you've previously focused on exactly that one of the things the Navy and the maritime domain, they've got a lot of really solid physics-based, even starting to handle the really complex sense of the ocean, but they managed to use certain tools for that and separately use certain tools for that decision-making, that warfighting that is much more about assumptions about the time and place, yet making sure those assumptions are tied to the reality, in your terms, the assumptions about how fast that missile is going to get there and how soon I'm going to see it. The math is right underneath that. How have you seen that done in the maritime domain?
Well, I'm a little hesitant to draw that connection because the two problems in the maritime domain, I think, are somewhat separable in that the physics-based problems tend to be missile defense, sonar detection. They tend to be tactical, and they're very technical. But the strategic level problems are things like interrupting trade, mostly, or being able to flow forces anywhere on the globe, and what the strategic effects are. And those strategic questions tend not to rely on the physics. The other thing is that a lot of those naval strategic effects tend to have a time scale of months to years because they are economic usually. And I think while I agree that there's going to be a lot of strategic effects from the Space Force, in many cases things may happen much more quickly. So there might be a tighter connection between the tactical considerations and the strategic considerations than you would find in the naval medium. We have obviously wargamed a lot of joint operations in futures for force planning purposes. Space is always attempted to be included in that, and it's generally a challenge. Partly it's a challenge because of classification issues. Partly it's a challenge because a large number of the players don't understand the medium, and so there's a stovepiping problem. But I think that there's a real need there to try to sort out how the things that happen in the space stovepipe are going to link into a wider warfighting campaign. There's a lot of questions about escalation, when things have to happen. And the other way I think space is significantly different from the naval domain is that the Navy kind of owns all the assets it needs to enforce sea control. That's not really true of the Space Force, because while they'll be doing the operations in orbit, a lot of space control operations require strike or cyber, which will not be under direct Space Force control. I mean, operationally is one thing, but as a force planner, those live in a different service. And so I think there's a need for tighter integration than we've traditionally seen.
And Becca, that gets back to you. You know, there's a debate right now about what strategic effects space provides. How well have we gone from that very physics-based, hey, I guarantee this signal is flowing through the electromagnetic spectrum with no problem, to the more tactical, still very physics-based, how are these two satellites interacting as they both orbit the Earth, to those really big questions Webb sensed. How much does the joint force get degraded? Can we be coerced because of that? Or even better, can we start coercing directly from space by interrupting economic effects? How well is analysis grappling with that debate?
I think that's where a lot of the friction and trouble is right now. So I'd say we're working through that. So not good, I guess. I think part of what also makes it tricky is that when especially if we're talking about like scenario-based development, optimizing your space architecture for, say, a particular scenario might not be the best idea, just because it's a little bit harder to sort of move satellites than it is to move boats and tanks. They're moving on their own, but their trajectory is more or less set once you launch them. Moving them around for a different AOR is not as easy as moving, again, ships and tanks. And so I think just in terms of the optimizing and the planning and the thinking about how to do this at a strategic level requires that sort of extra level of consideration.
And to defend the space domain, Mike, can I go to you? Strategic effects are always a little bit tricky, right? Because getting the causal arrow is difficult, especially when we just don't know, right? We haven't seen it in effect. We have occasionally seen a naval blockade. We've seen the not blockade not be as effective as we expected. How often do you see in decision-making support an assumption about strategic effects informing the analysis, or hopefully the analysis helping tee up of, we're assuming that strategic effect before it's actually achieved?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of, failure modes in terms of analytic support to decision making that are highlighted in this conversation. One may be that often the decision makers and the analysts might view uncertainty as the other party's problem principally. And this goes back to the point that Webb raised in the beginning of the discussion, is as you aggregate operations from the technical to the tactical to the operational to the strategic, the uncertainty grows, right? And not only the uncertainty about what the variable settings might be in your scenario or your operation, but the uncertainty about even the nature of these effects. When you're talking about things like escalation and trying to and deterrence and affecting human decision making, so that there's a morass of uncertainty that often the analysts look to the senior leaders to say, well, tell me what the assumptions ought to be. And the senior leaders are looking to the analysts to say, well, I want options. Tell me what my risks are if I go left, right, middle, up, or down. And I think frequently that uncertainty gets lost in the conversation. Ideally, you'd be able to have an iterative discussion about that sort of thing, but that's much easier said than done. And I think there's a couple different dimensions of it that I want to highlight. One is kind of purely analytic. How do you sort of honestly, rigorously capture these uncertainties around strategic effects without taking years, to do so? But the other dimension, which I think is worth mentioning here, is the bureaucratic aspect of the role of analysis in force planning, force development, decision support. And the reason I think that's worth highlighting here is just because that is particularly new for the Space Force, right? The integrating space into joint command and control, battle space awareness, whatever operational categories you want to talk about, that's been a challenge that people have been working on for as long as we've had military space assets. What's new is how does the Space Force as an organization fit into the community of activities, both in terms of force development and analysis, and the feedback loops that we go through in terms of budgeting and force development. That's something that I think requires at least, just as much attention and care as the sort of analytic side of things, and requires the integration of multiple pieces of the organization and expertise, not just the analysts, not just the force planners, but the whole enterprise, if you will.
And one of the reasons we're seeing this focus on changing the classification levels of space to try to bring it into a broader community. But I also wanted to go back to you, Mike. You came close there, right? Webb was willing to pick a fight about the tools itself. Is there a way to use the different tools of analysis, wargaming, game boards, hardcore campaign modeling, physics-based, really particular physics-based models? Is there a way to best use them to try to dispel some of that uncertainty you flagged as just endemic?
Well, yes, but I'd say it's as much art as science, right? And lesson number one, I think I would argue, is that the proper combination of tools to apply to the question has to be tailored. There's no formula for this. And, I agree with what Webb said, that ultimately this is not about creating answers. It's about decision makers working with the intuition that is an essential part of making process of future strategic effects. So all of the tools that you mentioned, from the mission models, engineering models, even campaign models, despite their limitations, war games, PTXs, everything you can name has a potential place in this conversation, but the mix of them has to be tailored to the question, right? I think that's maybe the art piece is how do you combine those? And like I said, there's no formula for doing that properly. So I think, at least I hope that's consistent with the way Webb was looking at it before.
Yeah, I'm in violent agreement with what you just said.
Webb,
I think the big problem that I run into a lot is I think when wargaming came back into vogue, we have a lot of decision makers or sponsors who want to do a war game instead of analysis, or they want to pick one tool. And the problem is, for these complicated problems, it really is a mix. And of course, how that mix drifts depends on where along the spectrum of problems you're worried about, right? At the strategic level, you do more gaming. The closer you get down to things you can actually measure, you do more computer modeling, analysis in the middle. But fundamentally, yeah, it's an art form to pick the right mix. And I wish it was more generally understood that these complex problems need multiple tools, not just one.
Yeah, I'm going to just agree. I was going to say, I think the space world is very much going through those growing pains right now, sort of, well, for their first time. They're very comfortable with the physics-based modeling. Again, that's more where we've been for 60 years. And so it's understood, it's understandable, there's no ambiguity. And expanding out and getting people to think, beyond that level, I think is definitely been a bit of a struggle. And as we were just saying, they're definitely exploring things like wargaming, but I think there's still a bit of that lack of understanding that wargaming does not replace analysis. And I think there needs to be a better, appreciation for the role that they play, their relative strengths and weaknesses, and how to use those things in concert to actually roll up to useful, actionable decision support.
Mike teed up there, analysts know they need that input and are looking for decision makers. Mike has flagged in his writing that one of the problems is decision makers are intentionally trying to keep their options open. They have lots of audiences they're signaling to. If we're never just going to get the simple answer of, well, here's what I want you to go query, how do you run wide enough scenarios? How do you run situations that start exploring that and become tools to help policymakers think about what kind of questions they want to ask?
I would say in one instance, I understand the behavior you're talking about. And I think that there's a lot of analysts, especially people that work on the technical end, really don't handle uncertainty well. I think decision makers might be better at it, but as you point out, no decision before it's time. So if you're talking about motivating a decision, I think one of the more important things you can point out is that inaction is a decision and will have consequences. So if you're really trying to motivate somebody, in that regard. There is, it's not like you can't kick the can down the road forever. It's if you choose to do something now, that will have implications.
Well, and I think if you don't do anything, that's just the continuation of status quo, right? And I think there's a lot of desire to change that, but that also then requires much more of that strategy level, which is not the physics-based modeling level. And so maybe there's also a bit of a need of top-down guidance from senior leaders as to what kind of strategy is permissible to them. But at the same time, they probably need a better intuitive understanding of the physics or of the space domain in order to do that. So I think there might be a little bit of a chicken and egg there as an idea.
Yeah, exactly so. I mean, we certainly see that on the wargaming table. I hope that the real war planners have probably sorted this out for today's capabilities. But of course, most of these conversations are for building future capabilities where things might not work the same way. So there's yet another level of uncertainty. But I think there's that feedback there. I think there's two places where there's specific mismatches. One is where the logical actions that you need to take inside the space domain might not sit within the Joint Commander's campaign plan. In a lot of these great power wars, at the beginning of the crisis, the strategic commanders are looking for off-ramps and ways to avoid the war, whereas space needs to act promptly to make sure you don't lose space control because it's a first actor advantaged medium. So that's one disconnect. I think the other disconnect is because there are services that rely heavily on space capabilities or in having the adversary's capabilities denied, particularly the Navy, that there might be some of the adversary capabilities might be higher priority targets than the Space Force might realize. And while you might prefer to use your limited capabilities in some ways, the joint campaign may actually require you to do different things. So those are the two places, I think, where there's a feedback loop that needs to happen. And game table is one way to do it. There are other ways to do it. But at least from where I sit, I don't see it happening at the moment.
I haven't managed to get Becca to do her own plugging. I've talked about Mike's paper. We've several times pointed out the counterintuitive nature of the physics of space. Becca has a paper that is trying to take her deep physics understanding and make it available to even a layman like me, let alone a busy policymaker. So I hope that will help the conversation a little bit. I'm not quite responsive to where Webb was going, but Webb's earlier point about the inaction is an action itself. One of the problems for those in the beast, as all of you have been, you still got your day job, right? Even if you haven't heard from the president what they plan on doing, you still got to get to the next step. How much does that just needing to fill in an assumption create a perverse or effect in the analysis or amongst the tools?
Well, I don't know if it's a perverse effect, but I think that there is this dynamic. I lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
So I'll be curious to come back and explore that, how the analysis starts getting in its own way. But I also want to pick up, Webb, you've mentioned it a couple times, right? You just talked about space's specific problem, switching between domains. You offered the canonical example from the past, which is we had our scenarios, we had our modeling for in theater, no problem, and we hadn't bothered to do the force flow to figure out whether or not we could actually get everything there. How do you see space overcoming that, or the joint force overcoming that as we start to move between domains to achieve cohesive effects?
Well, what actually happened in the transport case is we had done the analysis, but the assumptions that were being used inside the force planning process were contradicted by it. So we were in a case of internal contradiction. All you can do in that case is point those things out and hope the system fixes them. I'm not sure I have a good way to. I'm not sure I understand the Space Force problem well enough to opine on how it's going to wind up interacting with the rest of the bureaucratic force planning process. I think Mike's still trying to get back to his
I don't know
early stages. So
I don't know if I'm quite answering your question.
Do you see the efforts to try to resolve them?
I don't know about contradictions. I think part of the problem is that we have some, say, campaign model or tools that are maybe, call it, kind of saturated in terms of the effects and things that can be seen in them. So if you want to try to integrate space into that, it might just be a fool's errand a little bit, because the tools just aren't sort of prepared to absorb them, which just requires that maybe a different kind of approach or perspective is needed for bringing space fully to the table. I don't think I really fully answered your question there, but that's sort of, I think, been part of the problem, is that we're just trying to tape space onto existing approaches and methodologies, as opposed to maybe taking a step back and figuring out the best way to actually integrate.
Okay, I would agree with that. One of the biggest weaknesses of the existing campaign models is they do not play the command and control layer well. The force maneuvers tend to be hardwired in at the beginning. They kind of implicitly assume perfect information unless you put a kludge in. And so there's no kind of active way to look at the feedback of the way a variation in, PNT or comms would affect the terrestrial warfighting. In theory, that could be done. The reason it hasn't happened is just because, as you say, the models are big and complex. That takes effort. No one's had the incentive to put those capabilities in. But I'm not sure that the juice would be worth the squeeze in that case. I mean, Mike might have a different opinion, but clearly it's not plug and play with the current models in use.
Yeah,
I agree, and I think
that relates to the point that I was going to make a minute ago. So I think related both to that point about which details are being captured and your question about assumptions. Well, I think one of another difficulty of accurately or reasonably capturing the effect of uncertainty in all this is a tendency, I think, there's almost a cultural bias in DoD to elaborate more detail, right? I think that I don't know exactly what the cause of this is, but there's a lot of engineering expertise inside the force development world. There's also this notion of accountability that doing low resolution analysis is harder to defend, because somebody can always ask the next layer question of what did you assume about the next layer of detail. An example from that always sticks in my mind is we're doing sort of strategic level analysis about what might happen in a campaign, and we can't really get to the answers until we have conversations about what percentage of the ramp space at that particular commercial civilian airport is that ally going to allocate to the DoD operations that are going on what timeline. It's not that that's an unimportant factor, but at some level, if you're going to do a good job accounting for uncertainty, there's going to be a price to be paid in the depth to achieve that breadth. And I think that's a common challenge in the DoD analytic culture, is to sort of allow the low resolution analysis to proceed in order to capture a wider range of potential variables or scenarios, what have you. And low resolution analysis is not just wargaming, right? There's a variety of ways to get after this. Not just about interactions with people, true analysis, but where the emphasis is on studying the kind of the big picture variables and not requiring to get down to those low level variables. So that's another thing to put in the mix, I think, as we talk about how to align different tools and techniques to support this analysis, to keep that as one of your tools. It's sort of this low resolution analysis to account for a wider range of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think the key is figuring out what question are you trying to answer and what level of fidelity tools are best suited to answer that question. I think, again, it's just like you're saying, the higher up, the ladder, sort of the more strategic level, the farther away you are from the things that are easier to defend because they're not physics-based. And so, is it how you piece together outputs from different tools and roll them into each other? Or is it that you have to understand this part of the question space can be answered by this kind of methodology and this other part of the question space is here? And how do we bridge these together to, actually come up to some higher level decision? There's no easy answer here. Again, this is true for all domains. I think it's just, again, very foreign to the space world to have to defend something that isn't, an engineering level question.
Webb, that kind of brings back to the question I'd asked you earlier. My sense is that's something the Navy has done well, is toggle between highly accurate physics-based models and low-resolution tools to consider bigger and broader strategic questions.
That phrased that way, I concur in that the Navy certainly doesn't say model the effects of an economic blockade the same way they model a warfight, right? One is a low resolution model and one's a pretty high resolution model. And that's probably the appropriate tool in each case. And so if this just evolves to saying that Space Force is going to need an equally large toolkit and these less technical tools are going to need to be in it, I think that's probably a good takeaway from this discussion. I think that's, despite what differences that we panelists may have, I think we'd probably all sign up to that particular point.
Because Becca, that's one of the things you're seeing is we have these very detailed, in fact, in some ways, space has easier physics than the thermodynamics of the oceans. And so we have really, really high fidelity models. How do you leave that fidelity on the cutting room floor to try to get up to the next level? That it's got to be just crushing as an analyst to know you're passing up a chance to see something in greater detail.
I think that's part of that culture change that needs to happen with the Space Force at large, is understanding what strategy and space is and means, and figure out how you go about, analyzing it or defending your decisions to do so. And so again, maybe just go back to Webb in terms of, right now the Space Force seems to be looking at things like gaming to help with that. But again, sort of now trying to understand that gaming is not a replacement for analysis, or it's not identical to, again, strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches or methodologies. So, Webb, talk about gaming and analysis relative to each other.
Right. And that's probably, especially if there's already a strong cultural bias towards highly detailed physics models, rather than trying to convince the modelers to do something less exact, coming in from the gaming end is probably better. Then the question becomes, though, there's really two options. One is to have game adjudication cells that have enough knowledge of the results of all those detailed technical analyses so that the game runs appropriately and takes into account And the other option is to literally have some of those models available and running during the game as part of the adjudication. But it would be in the background. It wouldn't be the focus and effect. Either of those ways can bridge that divide. And as Mike said earlier, this is an art. And getting the buy-in from the players and the decision makers is part of the art form.
Can I add one point to that too, which is, and this is hearkening back to what I mentioned earlier, the importance of attaching the flywheel of all this analysis to the transmission of the department's actual decision-making processes. And I think that is a landscape that's very much unstable, or it's in motion, in the sense that you have the emergence of a new joint warfighting concept and supporting concepts paired with a new push, and many of your audience will be familiar with this. Just in the most recent months of the vice chairman trying to push the requirements process, JSIDs and the operation of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, to a more proactive stance toward capability portfolio management. And so, how the department is trying to conceive of capability portfolios, this is very much wet concrete. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about how to do this, but nominally it's mapped to the functional capability boards and the JSIDs process. So as a Space Force, this is going to be considered cross-cutting with other command and control and cyber capabilities in one FCB, the functional capability board, battle space awareness in another one. So both of those are areas that the department is looking at from a portfolio perspective that includes space, but also includes many other things. But exactly how you map forces and programs and budgets into those portfolios is, a work in progress. And so all of that is something that the analysts, both those who are designing the analytic, programs or processes for the departments, and the analysts who are doing the work themselves, have to keep an eye on, because I think all of that shapes both how the decision makers are going to be consuming that information and the timelines on which the analytic products can be relevant or not. And this is all in motion. I think that's important to keep in mind, as much so as tailoring analytic tools to analytic questions.
And that's a great point, Mike. General Hyten actually kind of teed that up himself in his interview last week, right? Or a couple of weeks ago, where he said, a capability within a service's purview, I want them to just move out and get done with it. Let's not do all this extra oversight. But then also, hey, I want this to be a cohesive whole too, and that's going to require some joint staff involvement. How can analysis help with that and identify those themes of, go polish this in your little world, smooth as you can get it, and here's where we need to find the seam where it's going to start affecting others?
As a practical matter, the bureaucracy is somewhat of a competitive sport, right? And so the one thing I would take from this discussion is that it underlines why the Space Force needs its own set of analysts who are capable of looking at the joint level warfight so that it can defend its interests at the joint level, even if it doesn't usually use those analysts to influence its own internal decisions. As much as we'd like to think we all cooperate, in practice, that JSIDS process is pretty bloody, and the resource allocation process is very zero-sum and competitive. And the Space Force will not compete well in that realm if all it has is technical analysis that makes sense to the Space Force and not to anyone else.
I think that point you just made, Webb, is both absolutely accurate and also, part of the problem. The fact that we have to think in terms of that competition for perspectives across organizations is unfortunate, but part of the landscape we're dealing with. But I completely agree that having a cadre of analysts and a program of analysis that has that joint cross-cutting perspective is an important, table stake for the Space Force.
And to make sure we invoke yet another one of our sister FFRDCs, the longtime RAND analyst Carl Bilder, whose famous book is often used as a service culture, but was really about how the different services approached analysis, right? And he had his little thumbnail sketches. And it's super exciting to watch Space Force step into that, develop their own culture, see that transmitted into analysis, and see their analysis run into everybody else's. So we've been talking for a while. I've learned a ton, as I always do every time I talk to each one of you, let alone together. It turns out, you talk about big defense problems, the problems have lots of causes. We've talked about the uncertainty. We've talked about the difficulty of moving from models to decision-making. How about we end a little more positively? What is it about today's analysis realm that makes you exciting? Is it new tools? Is it a better appreciation for these difficulties? Is it just having yet a new player on the scene on a domain that we're tipping into different dynamics with?
Well, maybe this is making lemonade out of lemons, to be sure, but this sort of transition into great power competition, if that's what we're calling it, and the pretty significant challenges we now face across conventional force operations, nuclear deterrent, and especially the marriage of those two. And space forces will have, is absolutely critical to both of those, of course, and that integration, the nuclear conventional force integration. I think a lot has happened in the last few years with respect to Russian and Chinese capabilities that really focuses the mind and focuses some of the effort, and maybe, I think, fair to say, spur to innovation. That's true in the technological sense. It's in the force planning sense, and I hope in the analytics sense.
I have a reputation of being a very negative person, Russ, so that's a challenge to answer your question. But I would take two things that I see from the new joint warfighting concept process and the new portfolio management process. And one is, I will echo what Mike just said, which is that our current challenges are so great that they tend to be focusing the mind. So I think with the building will tend to more cooperation and less competition because we can't really afford as much internal competition. The other thing that I've noticed positively, at least within the joint warfighting construct, is that the analysis and gaming in support of that seems to be much more comfortable admitting uncertainties. And they are trying to draw a much wider canvas than the previous SSA processes did in terms of considering variables in technology availability, variables in threat aggression, basically a large number of the big uncertainties that we all know there are in these problems. They seem to be admitting them kind of inside the process instead of as a attempt to paper after the fact. And that will lead to much more robust solutions. So I think that's a positive thing.
And I'll just say, I think it's an exciting opportunity. I think it was General Raymond who said, right now that we're creating the first new service in over 50, 60 years, we want to design it in such a way that it's the envy of all the other services, an opportunity to sort of do things right from the beginning, learning from the other folks, other services. My cat has an opinion. But, that includes the strategy and the decision support and all the different aspects that make a service a service, or even the reestablishment of U.S. Space Command. She's coming back for more in a second, I think. So an opportunity to figure out all that stuff fresh. So again, just reiterate what was said before, let's not just try to tape space on the existing, approach, but let's try to reinvent all of it from the ground up in the best way possible. And so that's exciting.
Well, I, of course, could keep talking about this stuff for a long time, but maybe we should take the cat's cue and recognize that we should find a nice stop port, especially since all of you, despite severe analytic bents, did manage to come up with something positive. I'm very proud of you. It is an exciting time. It's an exciting time to be at FFRDC. The three represented here are sister ones. All of the people with deep expertise in the for-profit and contractor firms who bring such sophisticated tools to this question, and of course all of our counterparts in governments who have to live through the daily life and still be conversant in all the things we just discussed. So it's an exciting time for space. It's an exciting time for analysis. And thanks everybody. Thanks to all of you for joining us to try to explore some of those issues. We'll try to come up with some excuse to do Russell. It again, maybe not on the screen.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. We are so glad to have you. Thanks, Russell, Michael, Rebecca, and Webb. It was a great conversation today. We really appreciate it. As usual, you can find us on Twitter at #TheSpacePolicyShow. You can ask our experts any questions you want on Vimeo in the dialogue box below. And you can sign up for our news alerts. We're at aerospace.org/policy. Until next time, take care.